Morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. Thank you for making the time to join the webinar. As we wait for others to join, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and let us know where you're joining from. My name is Simran Singh. I'm a Communications and Capacity Building Officer at the BASE Foundation, and I will be moderating today's panel. BASE and SEforALL are thrilled to host a conversation with four powerhouse panelists on the gender and cooling nexus, zooming in on the role of data in designing policies, interventions, and projects that account for and respond to women's specific needs. The timing of this discussion could not be more pertinent. Heat waves are pushing temperatures to their highest levels ever recorded. Access to cooling no longer remains a comfort issue, but also, and increasingly so, a climate, health, and social justice issue. A lack of access to electricity and cooling appliances can impact women differently than men and can exacerbate existing gender inequalities. Our objective today is to explore potential solutions and showcase real-life examples that demonstrate how we can rectify these long-standing disparities, particularly by leveraging the power of data. Since we will be talking about how cooling can be made gender responsive, let's make sure we align on our understanding of the term. Borrowing the definition used by the UN Population Fund and UNICEF, gender responsiveness goes beyond integrating an understanding of gender dynamics within the program design and includes specific action to try and reduce gender inequalities within communities to ensure that no one is left behind. With that, let me now introduce you to our wonderful panelists. We have with us on the panel today, Martha Vocoli, Senior Associate at CLASP, Georgia Pascoletto, Energy Efficiency and Cooling Specialist at SEforALL, Roberta Evangelista, Sustainable Data Scientist and Digitalization Specialist at BASE, Perry Hewitt, Chief Marketing and Product Officer at data.org. By the way of agenda, I will ask each panelist a couple of foundational questions that they will then have an opportunity to answer. During the last 10 minutes of the webinar, we hope to engage in a dynamic Q&A. So I invite you to post your questions in the chat box for those joining us on Zoom and in the comment section for those joining us on LinkedIn. With that, I invite Georgia to provide us with more context on where we stand on our understanding of women and their cooling needs.
Thank you very much, Simran, and thank you everyone for joining today. I have just a few slides, and it is my pleasure to be here today to set the scene for this very important conversation. So first, I would like to thank, of course, the BASE Foundation for co-organizing this webinar with us. And also I would like to thank the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the Austrian Development Agency for their support to our cooling work. So I would like to start this webinar just by providing some key insights from our Chilling Prospects report. So the Chilling Prospects report is an analysis that since 2018 has been, let's say, the first of its kind to map and try and quantify the magnitude of the cooling access challenge. And this year, for the first time, we have published a special on gender and access to cooling that provides gender disaggregated data on cooling access gaps. And it gives an overview of what are the factors of vulnerability. And it also issues a call to action for gender responsive cooling services, solutions, and finance. And this analysis really serves as a sharp reminder for us and for the community that equitable access to cooling is necessary to meet many of the Sustainable Development Goals, including with important linkages to Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality. So in 2022, we estimated that overall in 54 countries that are high impact for access to cooling, there are approximately 1.2 billion people that are living in rural and urban poor areas that are at high risk of lacking any access to cooling services. With this second step of analysis, looking into gender disaggregated data, our initial findings suggest that more than 719 million women and 448 million men are at high risk in these 54 high-impact countries. So this shows that women could be as much as 1.6 times more at risk than men of lacking access to cooling solutions to protect them from heat. So these are populations that may not have access to cooling to keep safe food and medicines, and are more likely to suffer from heat-related illnesses at home and at work. They might even see their revenues decrease as a result of lacking agricultural cold chains to store and sell their products. And we will hear a lot more about this over the course of the webinar. So when it comes to women, there are other factors of risk, because women might also see an increase in their time, in the time that they spend doing household chores, to keep fresh food on the table, or to collect water during a heat wave. So the gender implications are very important, and we really try to dig deeper and understand these nuances. In addition to this population at high risk, we also have estimated that 2.47 billion people, lower middle income people, are on the brink of buying cooling technologies, but may lacking options that are both affordable and sustainable. And we will be publishing more data, gender disaggregated data on these populations later this year. So what are the risk factors? Our analysis overall looks at risk factors such as temperature, such as lack of electricity access, and income, particularly income below the poverty line, as well as the distribution of these factors in rural and urban areas, and where the populations are that reside in informal settlements like urban slums, for example. So population at high risk, like the 719 million women that I shared before, they lack access to electricity, and they live below the international poverty line. So they are also more likely to live in poorly ventilated or poorly constructed homes, and may not have a refrigerator at home to keep their food fresh, or may have difficulties accessing heat-resilient health services, especially for medicines and vaccines that require to be stored under certain temperatures. So in rural area particularly, the population at high risk is likely to engage in subsistence farming, but lack adequate cold chains that enables them to sell the products at higher prices or accessing markets that are further afar. And so a growing body of literature is suggesting that these factors, such as electricity access, poverty, household dynamics, health, and working conditions, really shape different cooling needs for men and women, especially during heat waves, especially in vulnerable settings. But what we found is that there is a persistent lack of sex disaggregated data, even on these macro indicators. And this gap really poses serious difficulties to assessing these factors and determining what are the specific cooling needs of both genders. So we started digging deeper and started to break down and gather evidence on some of these risk factors. So for example, when we look at poverty, individuals and communities are restricted from accessing cooling technologies such as air conditioners, fans, or even investing in insulating their homes, or in adaptation strategies such as retrofitting their houses, ventilation systems, or even poverty might even, sometimes it's correlated to restricted access to heat-resilient infrastructure like green spaces. So in rural areas in particular, there is a broader pool of unmet cooling needs, especially because the electricity access gap is much larger still in rural areas, and poverty rates tend to be higher than in urban areas, including for women. So you see here, it is estimated that by 2030, over 83% of the world's extreme poor women and girls will be concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Southern Asia. Then if we go a step deeper and look within households, we need to understand how gender norms shape different cooling needs and heat-related risks. There's evidence that during heat waves, for example, women sometimes are expected to shoulder additional burden in the households for food preparation, for caring for the children and the elderly during heat extremes, and also collect water. While men may experience higher risks due to their engagement in outdoor activities or even outdoor jobs. However, a lot of the evidence that is out there and a lot of the data, for example, on poverty is collected at household level. And it makes it really difficult to understand intra-household disparities and how men and women experience heat and poverty differently, because without assuming that resources are shared equally within the households. So there needs to be more research and more data on how household disparities affect heat-related risks. When we look at health and well-being, the research suggests that biological sex per se is not a determinant of different risks, but that there are specific lived experiences and social attributes where gender really contributes to greater vulnerabilities related to heat stress. For example, this includes pregnancy and childbirth. It includes pre-existing conditions that might be more frequent in men or women and might increase the vulnerability to heat. And it also affects children and the elderly differently, especially when living in poor settings or poorly built households. There were other examples, for example, from refugee camps that suggest that gender can also determine different abilities to access water and sanitation during hot days. So roughly 1 billion people in low and lower middle income countries are also served by healthcare facilities that lack any electricity or reliable electricity. And so in this sense, delivering heat resilient care really means prioritizing sustainable electrification of health facilities, including targeting services during pregnancy and childbirth, and also providing efficient refrigeration equipment to health facilities, and potentially investing in passive and efficient building design for these facilities to ensure thermal comfort during heat waves. But again, improved data is needed to assess how physiological and social attributes determine different cooling needs. And for example, there are studies recently that show that women's physiological vulnerability may be sometimes offset by stronger social support networks that, on the contrary, men are more likely to lack. Then we looked at workplace, and of course, in many of the countries that are high impact for lack of access to cooling, agriculture is an important engine of growth and employment, but it can also reinforce existing gender inequality and poverty patterns. For example, women represent up to 50% of the agricultural workforce in some of these countries, but only 15% of agricultural landholders. And this really reflects the difficulties that women face in accessing productive assets that could increase agricultural outputs and income. Women also tend to be more involved in post-harvest activities, where they are more likely to be affected by the lack of access to refrigeration. So again, data to assess the gender impact of the lack of sustainable cold chains remains really scarce. But if we combine the prominent role of women in agriculture using available data and the available data on food losses, we can shed some light on the magnitude of this problem. If we consider that in the countries that we are studying, these 54 countries, the average food loss is 35 kilos per person per year, and they range between 3.8, but also as much as 62 kilo of food losses per person per year. So again, we need to dig deeper and understand how women can also play an active role in reducing, both benefit from agricultural cold chain solution and also play an active role in bridging these cold chain gaps and reducing food loss. Finally, the last dimension that we looked in terms of workforce, we see that women make up a significant number of workers in the informal sector, which often is associated to precarious and vulnerable conditions, such as lower wages, lack of cooling and water services, or even lack of dedicated toilet facilities for women, which can really make a difference during heat waves. We have also found evidence of subrepresentation of women in management and supervision positions. And this is another obstacle in addressing and understanding cooling needs in the workplace. So just a few examples. In India, women represent 50% of the workforce in brick kilns, where heat exposure is extreme. And it's really important to develop solutions that can target their specific need on the workplace, but data is very scarce. And at the same time, female workers account for over 80% of the workforce in the textile, garment, and footwear industry, where they are exposed for high temperatures from machinery. And this already gives us a pointer of where, to target some of the gender responsive solutions. But we also found that only 5% of factory supervisors are female. And so the ability to make decision-making in the workplace, it adds another layer of complexity. So finally, mainstreaming gender in access to cooling intervention means mainstreaming gender considerations in assessing cooling needs, and also then in designing sustainable solutions. So designing technologies, designing services, policies, and also financial solutions that can really meet the needs of women. Just one last piece of example, other evidence that we found from agriculture and fisheries sector in Mozambique shows us the majority of the farmers and small-scale producers that were accessing grant schemes from this program were men. And this really raised the need to design financing solutions and business development support services that directly targets women. This is an overview, and I hope it's an interesting scene setting for this presentation. And Simran, I hand it over to you, and I'm happy to take any questions from the chat.
Thank you, Georgia. That was wonderful. Thank you for shedding light on the gender differentiated impacts of increasing of temperatures and barriers impeding practitioners and policymakers from adequately addressing women's cooling needs. Recognizing these factors, of course, provides a solid foundation for identifying areas in need of improvement and entry points for action. But before we can approach the solutions, let's zoom out a bit and try to understand where we stand in terms of women's access to energy in general. And for this, I would like to pose my next question to Martha. So Efficiency for Access and CLASP have undertaken extensive work on analyzing household surveys on energy access. What were some of the findings on that you had regarding the gender and energy nexus, and especially when you undertake the analysis through the lens of intersectionality? So over to you, Martha.
Thanks for the introduction, Simran, and hello, everyone. I hope I'm audible. As was mentioned, my name is Martha Wakoli. I'm a senior associate at CLASP, where I co-lead the research workstream under LAIR. Before I get into the content, let me just take a moment to introduce Efficiency for Access for the benefit of those in the audience who may not have interacted with our work before. Next slide, please. So Efficiency for Access is a global coalition working to promote high-performing appliances that enable access to clean energy for the world's poorest people. It is co-managed by CLASP and our UK partners, the Energy Saving Trust, and the flagship program under Efficiency for Access is called LAIR, and that's funded by the FCDO and the IKEA Foundation. So LAIR uses multiple instruments to intervene in the appliance sector, including testing and quality assurance, awards. We deploy R&D grants to companies, and we conduct our own research with partners. We then publish and disseminate our learnings from these multiple activities to contribute towards the evidence pool needed for decision-making in the sector. I'll now respond to the question posed by our moderator by sharing insights from the inclusivity research report that we published in September. For us, this was a first step towards establishing a baseline to understand how well the appliance sector is performing across different dimensions of inclusivity, like gender, poverty, and disability. Next slide, please. So for this research, we conducted a meta-analysis of 19 household surveys spanning over 5,000 solar lighting and appliance customers in 8 countries and self-reported data from 9 product manufacturers and distributors. Our findings indicate that the solar appliance sector is not doing enough to meet the needs of marginalized groups. Specifically, the report revealed that other than electric pressure cookers, the sector primarily serves a homogeneous demographic, with a typical appliance user characterized, as you can see on the screen, as a man in his early 40s in sub-Saharan Africa who is actually grid connected. He has at least a secondary education, with many of them being employed. He is more affluent than his peers. He does not report as having a disability, and he is included in the formal financial sector and is therefore able to leverage financing to purchase their appliance. Having said that, I'd like to highlight, while still on this slide, some challenges that we ran into while trying to build this profile. So 70% of our sample, when we were looking through the surveys and the data we collected, were not actually asked to report whether they had a disability. And of the 30% who were asked, 12% reported living with at least one disability, lower than the global average of 15%. So these kinds of missing observations and inconsistent definitions certainly limit our conclusions. Secondly, accurate and consistent income data is required to properly assess poverty and potential over-indebtedness once a user purchases an appliance. Yet, the data is really difficult to find. For instance, our sample included more than 2,000 often weak grid appliance users, but only 63 of those had income data reported. Then lastly, there was inadequate gender disaggregated data, which is crucial for gaining insights into the reach of solar products among women and understanding how women specifically utilize and interact with these appliances. Next slide, please. So to help us get a sense of the gender inclusivity in terms of employment, we used aggregate information provided by our partners, SEforALL and the Global Distributors Collective, to extract the insights that you're seeing on this slide. So what did we learn? We saw that women make up only 23% of the workforce. This trend mirrors the broader energy sector, where women make up just 22% of the total workforce. Secondly, 84% of companies did not report gender disaggregated employment data, and only 4% reported gender disaggregated pay data. This is a problem because better data and more inclusive company policies are vital to closing these gender gaps in hiring and compensation. And then finally, 72% of the companies sampled specialized in or distributed appliances and productive use equipment. However, only 5% of our surveyed distributors carry what we call the niche or nascent appliances traditionally perceived to benefit women. Next slide, please. So narrowing down into what we observed around gender inclusivity in cooling, our sample found that for cooling technologies like fans and fridges, 22 and 39% respectively were owned by women. Yet, even within this group, our sample suggests that women with access to solar products were better educated and more likely to be employed in some capacity than the average woman in their region. So if you're thinking about, let's say, the sub-Saharan African region, the people who would own a fan or a fridge are people like me, someone with a university education or at least a secondary school education, probably lives in an urban area or close enough to be grid connected and has some kind of income around it. So this highlights that when you study the inclusivity problem through the lens of intersectionality, even within marginalized groups, there are still people we leave behind. So overall, women comprise less than 40% of our sample, suggesting access barriers to solar lighting and appliances across sales, ownership, and usage. In relation to that point, we observed that female voices are often underrepresented in surveys that use random sampling methodology from existing company contact databases. Likewise, household surveys that interview the head of the household, especially in patriarchal societies, may also collect perspectives and usage data about products that are biased towards men. Next slide, please. So what we learned from conducting this research was that different sector players have access to different kinds of data sets and use a broad variety of metrics, meaning we all measure differently. Trying to collate this data made it clear to us that as a whole, the sector needs to mainstream the approach to surveys and data collection, and then improve the rigor and consistency of collecting this disaggregated data so that we have a lot more to work with. So how can we proactively take steps to consciously be more inclusive in energy research? So some of the recommendations I'm sharing on the screen today are included as part of the recommendations in the inclusivity research publication that I mentioned in the beginning. So on the survey front, it would be helpful to include an identification of the product's primary users, not just the purchaser, an examination of how the primary users employ the product, and then an assessment of the product's impact on the primary user. Next slide, please. And on the data collection process itself, we recommend the adoption of a gender-inclusive sampling approach to ensure equal representation of both women and men, conducting intra-household interviews to gather input from both men and women within the same household, disaggregating stakeholder groups during interviews or focus group discussions to create opportunities for women to express themselves freely. And then lastly, utilizing both female and male interviewers or data collectors while providing gender sensitivity training. So I hope that as I went through the presentation, you realized that it was essentially just an invitation for energy sector players to share data and collaborate more to allow the sector to move faster towards the ideal of leaving no one behind. Thank you all for your time and attention. And on that note, I'll hand over back to the moderator to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Martha. Definitely, I think as we talk about addressing women's needs and identifying them, what's most important is to make women visible in the data. Two crucial approaches required to address the underrepresentation and oversight of women are gathering data points specifically focused on women and empowering women to utilize the data effectively. These approaches aim to improve the representation of women in data and ensure that their voices are heard and acknowledged. And to tell us more about this, I would like to pose my next question to Perry. How can we move towards a more inclusive data culture? One where women's needs and experiences are equitably recorded and shared. And based on data.org's experience with its vast network of organizations working on data for social impact, what are some examples of best practices that stand out to move away from the bias and discrimination baked into our data practices? Over to you, Perry.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at BASE and SEforALL for organizing this event. It's really terrific. And I learned so much just listening to Martha just now about cooling. So my expertise is not in cooling or climate. I do serve on the board of Solar Sister in addition to my role at data.org. But I understand a little bit about how people take action, what are their motivations, and how do we begin to understand how to represent them in the world. So some of the underlying issues, just before we get to their slides, I think Martha's touched on. Countries and organizations don't invest enough in collecting gender statistics. When we were doing our Workforce Wanted report in 2022, we found a huge dearth of understanding, whether it was by industry or in this emerging field of data for social impact, who's taking which jobs, what does that look like, and what are the opportunities for women? So there's an opportunity to do better there, and we're working on that. But I was really struck by Martha's numbers of 84% of companies didn't report gender disaggregated employment data, and 96 didn't present it based on pay. So if you don't have the data, you don't have a starting point. Another real risk for us is data on issues facing women and girls aren't collected frequently, things that are unique. I mean, look at the gaps around caregiving data or periods, menstrual data. I swear a US fitness app would rather track the effect of male pattern baldness on running times than they would begin to look at menstrual data. So it took a long time to get there. There's a knowledge gap on collecting data on new and emerging issues, whether that's COVID-19, and of course, climate and cooling issues are going to create so many challenges for women in the next decade. And I think as these emerge quickly, whether it's the preponderance of flooding or extreme heat, we need to make sure that women are front and center in that data collection. And finally, I think people talk about this a lot, but it's still been a challenge to get people to understand the intersectionality of the social challenges we face. There's still a lot of discrete research into what does this mean for climate? What does this mean for the economy? What does this mean for K-12 education? Without pulling all that data together, and often the linchpin is women. Next slide, please. So As data.org, we're a platform for partnerships to build the field of data for social impact. So we're trying to work with organizations around the world, as well as with philanthropy, academia, social impact organizations, bring them together to how improve our use of data to tackle the world's most pressing problems. And of course, now that includes AI as well as data. How are we using these tools in order to assess the severity of the challenges we have and address them effectively? I threw in the slide because it was such an honor for us to meet the BASE team in Nigeria this year and to see their solutions on the ground. And it's a core tenet of data.org. And I think of anyone collecting data is to understand the local context. And again, previous speakers have touched on this, but without understanding the local context, you can't swoop in with globally informed solutions without seeing what are some of the challenges faced on the ground. So for example, with BASE, we were so fixated on the cooling, whereas there's a whole tangential number of challenges around how do you collect the cash for the cooling. So looking at the data and how it affects people and women on the ground in context is vital. Next slide, please. This was a quick look, and also the global gender gap report came out from the World Economic Forum yesterday. I also looked at that, really talks about the gaps in different sectors of representation of women. And this speaks to more, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And until we have more women in more seats advocating for data collection, it'll be hard to make us closer to parity. Next slide, please. So here are some of the key considerations. And again, some of these have been touched on, but how do we, from the beginning of a data project, to here's a problem we have to tackle and we need some data, to here are the solutions we implement. What are some of the things you need to think about? I think, ensuring people identifying as women are meaningfully involved in question development. That speaks to hiring, that speaks to consultants, that speaks to, the point raised earlier, don't just talk to the buyer, talk to the user of the product or the implementer of the agriculture, solution, rather than keeping it at a higher level. Work to establish community norms around gender data collection. These vary so much around the globe. Like, what is the best way to get at the data? What's an appropriate way to get at the data? How do you ask a question so that the question will be heard? And that's really, from a marketing communication standpoint, our area of expertise, which is we all have communications barriers in our roles, whether it's spouse to spouse, mother to child, colleague to colleague. Sometimes you say things and what the other person hears is very different. That's no different in gender data collection. You have to be really careful about not only how things are worded, but how they are delivered. What is the context in which you're getting that data? Collect data, just a general best practice with a specific and well-defined goal. It's really, really tempting to get every possible data point you want. As a researcher, as a marketer, everybody thinks more is better. But what can you actually understand and act on through the lens of gender? Standard points about the privacy and confidentiality and ethical standards. So how do you make sure that data is kept safely? In the US, where a lot of reproductive rights are in the process of being rolled back, people think a lot about that. For menstrual data, when was your last period? Is that data you give to your doctor? If you give that data to your doctor, what happens to that data? That's something we all need to think about, is what are the possible poor uses of that data as we collect data? And that could apply certainly to climate change issues and flood zones, et cetera. Make the data accessible. When data is publicly available and should be publicly available, making it accessible means not only sort of put it on a platform where it can live, but do people have the tools they need? Is there the local capacity to consume and use that data? How do we reinforce? How do we build the human systems and upskill people so that you have more data literate, data competent, data expert professionals in country able to use the data to craft local solutions to local problems? The goal of the data collection isn't just to ship it off to the global north and have somebody else devise a solution, right? In the countries that are hardest hit, there are the people who are smartest and most up to date on how to address the local challenges brought by climate, brought by lack of cooling. So ensuring that that data is accessible in the local context is really important. And finally, measure usage and impact frequently, whether it's online education or gender data. People plop stuff, on the internet into databases all the time, and don't have a great sense of, is it being used? By whom is it being used? What are some of the challenges with the data? So the journey doesn't end in the data collection. It ends, of course, you want people crafting solutions, but you also want to know, like, is the data as we presented it, as we've stored it, something that's helping people craft solutions? And I just threw some logos on there of organizations who I think are doing amazing work in this context. Next. So in my role as marketing and digital product for data.org, one of the things we know is making it memorable is key. It's really important for people to understand sort of how are people acting on this data? Why does gender data matter? So we could write a white paper, and there are terrific white papers out there. I looked at the World Economic Report yesterday, and that's a really important part of the puzzle. But it's also important to show individual stories, like give people use cases, examples, exemplars. And this is where working with BASE has been a tremendous opportunity for us to understand sort of what is the local story and how has data in one context made a difference in the world. You might inspire another organization who's using a similar technology to do something very different, or you might find another organization who's solving a very similar problem in a very different way, but without lifting up those individual stories. And I'm just plugging our Under Over campaign, which looks at marginalized groups, women, and people identifying as women, and said, how are they so underrepresented and overlooked in so many of these data conversations? And these are the first two stories. We'll be launching 3 in the fall and doing a series of 5 minutes with. So please recommend your friends. We're looking for women who are doing amazing work with data based on a personal experience they have that changed their professional trajectory. And while big data is vitally important, white papers are incredibly important. Making the case to people in ways they can understand and remember and share in the boardroom are also ways to convince people of the importance of gender data. Next. These are just a few of the people in our orbit that we have the privilege to work with as Solar Systems, both the grantee and I've migrated to the board there, the Rockefeller Foundation, obviously, Frame, working with Solar Sister on the data side, Women's World Banking, another Inclusive Growth and Recovery Challenge grantee, as well as our colleagues at the IDRC doing fabulous work with gender. Next. I think that's all from me, but thank you very much for your time today. I'm learning a lot about the cooling issues regarding gender, and I'll just continue to make the case for we need to think about what are the ways that we collect data, store data, apply data in a gender sensitive and inclusive way, but we also need to tell the story of the impact so that people will continue to invest in this important work. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Barry. I think what we really took away from that was there's definitely a need to improve the coverage, quality, accessibility, and timeliness of data for monitoring gender inequality, equality, and other SDGs. But beyond this, there's a need to make sure that data represents the lived reality of women and girls in all their diversity by addressing deep-seated biases in concepts, definitions, classifications, and this is all required to make women and girls more visible in data. And since we're talking about use cases and examples of how you can actually go about making data more gender inclusive, my next question is for Roberta, who leads a project at BASE called Your Virtual Cold Chain Assistant. So Roberta, my question to you is, what is your virtual cold chain assistant, and what were some of the gender-related challenges that you noticed when trying to universalize access to cold rooms in the agricultural sector? And what were some of the approaches that you have adopted to reach female farmers? And how has this helped amplify your impact? That was definitely more than one question, but please feel free to answer the ones that best fit the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Simran. Thanks everybody for connecting. It's a pleasure to be here and showcase your virtual cold chain assistant project as a use case in which we really look deep into how can we build gender sensitive solutions. So I would start by saying in the next slide that the main objective of the Your Virtual Cold Chain Assistant project is to enable smallholder farmers to access cold storage with the ultimate goal of reducing post-harvest losses and improving the livelihood of the farmers. The project builds on 3 key pillars. The first one is innovation with a cooling as a service business model, which basically means that we partner with local technology providers who are offering cold storage. They own, maintain, and operate the cold rooms, and the farmers can use the cold rooms just paying a small fee per day per crate of produce that they store. which means that the farmers in the end of the day don't have to do the upfront investment of buying the whole cold room, which is something that usually they cannot afford. The second aspect is digitalization. So we have developed a free-to-use mobile application, which we named Cultivate, to digitalize the operations at the cold room, which are currently done manually, and also to help users, so cooling companies, but also farmers, to remotely monitor what is happening at the cold room in terms of temperature, in terms of quality of the produce that it's stored in the rooms, in terms of occupancy and finances. And this also helps the farmers to track what is stored in the rooms and thus build a lot of trust in the solution. The third aspect, which is really crucial, is capacity building, because most of the cold rooms we are working with are multi-commodity and decentralized, and thus, especially in rural areas, they are a relatively new technology, which means that a lot of effort needs to be put into working together with farmers and with the operators of the cold rooms to understand how they can best leverage the benefit of cooling. And this is also a very important aspect that guarantees that the adoption of the solution is widespread. I'll just spend 1 minute talking about the context, which basically means why is this project needed at all? I mean, Georgia already started talking about this, and Perry and Marta also touched upon this, but just as a recap, we know that in low and middle income countries, 30 to 40% of the produce is lost post-harvest, and the lack of cooling is one of the main causes. And this not only affects the emissions in terms of CO2 emissions that come from the post-harvest losses and food security, but also has a strong impact on the income of the farmers, because of the lack of storing option, they are usually forced in the end of the day to sell for a very low price, whatever they have left. And these challenges are even more dramatic for women who already suffer from less access to finance, less access to trading opportunities. So we started tackling this issue using a combination of business model innovation, digitalization, and capacity building. Previous slide. What we did was basically partnering with local cooling companies in India, Nigeria, and the Philippines. And to date, the solution is deployed in 17 cold rooms. And we have estimated an impact of around 20% of post-harvest loss that has been avoided because of the use of cold storage, which results in around 20% increase of the revenue of the farmers. If we go to the next slide. Everything that I said so far was basically a quite lengthy introduction to actually come to the core question that I would like to present today, which is how did we make sure throughout the project design and implementation to include the perspective of female users. And I would like to mention here a couple of things. A first one, which is a very important one that Perry also discussed, is the importance of really talking with the users and understanding the local context on the ground so that you are sure that the solution that you are designing is actually tailored to the needs of the end users. And so we did this both in person and virtually. This is a process that it's always ongoing. We really try to engage them at all stages of the design process. And this is also something that has provided a lot of insights in terms of where should the project go next, what is it the users need the most now. Another important aspect is that when we started this project in India and Nigeria, we conducted surveys with more than 900 users to understand their profiles and their pain points. And two things emerged very clearly. One is that female smallholders were less likely to own a phone and a smartphone, which of course, if you want to create a digital solution, is an issue that you have to consider. And the second was that female smallholders were more likely to have little or no formal education. So if you go to the next slide, I'm highlighting how we try to tackle this in the app design. And I'm presenting three main things. The first aspect is that we made sure that for all the pilots location where the project is being currently carried out, the app is available in the local language. An important second aspect is that we tried wherever possible to use images and pictorial description rather than text. And the third aspect is that we integrated a SMS-based notification system so that the farmers or the potential users who don't have access to a smartphone can actually be reached with important notification, for example, about the remaining quality of the produce that they have in storage. We go to the next slide. On top of this, what we have done is we have collaborated with a gender expert to develop a gender strategy for the project. And the aim was really in this case to promote a more gender inclusive solution, which in the case of your virtual cold chain assistant actually means many different dimensions. For example, you can imagine that there is an aspect that relates with the accessibility of the cold rooms, both in a physical and in a cultural terms. At the same time, as we had this strong focus on capacity building, we are designing a lot of material and trainings. So the question was there, how do we make sure that the material that we design is appealing to female users and it's empowering these users to understand and to learn more about cooling solution and market dynamics. In the beginning of the year, we also launched our incubator, by which we onboarded 5 additional companies to implement servitization, integrate Cultivate into their operations, and importantly, shape their gender strategy with the aim of making sure that the solution that they were working on was reaching male and female users equally. And while doing this, we identified the need to actually strengthen the connections among the cooling companies that we are in contact with to facilitate their growth using servitization and digitalization, but also with a strong focus on doing this work with proper gender lenses. And this is why we have recently launched the Community of Practice for Cooling Companies, which is hosted under the Servitization for Energy Transition Alliance, which is a new initiative launched by BASE, which looks at servitization in a broader energy space. All the material that we have designed throughout the project is available on our website. And here I would like to focus on the comic strip that you see here on the left. This is something that we have developed to basically follow the journey of a female farmer while she starts using the cold room, or what are the benefits that she's getting from it. And the idea here was really to make sure that women are represented and visible in the cooling narrative. And this is also something that you can download from our website, and it's available in local languages, and it's also editable in case the material can be distributed to locations where we are not active yet. So in these last 2 slides, I want to showcase an example, which I think it's a very good way to see how the main activities of your virtual cold chain assistant go together with a very gender sensitive approach. And this is the example of Colfresh, which is one of the cooling companies that we are supporting in India. So their rooms are operated by groups of female self-help groups. So this already is sort of a help in terms of cultural accessibility to the cold rooms, because probably female farmers would be more incentivized to store the produce in a room in which they see that the operator is a woman. On top of this, the self-help groups also help with the commercialization of the crops, which makes sure on one side that the price that the users get for what they have stored is fair. And on the second aspect, which is especially relevant for women, is that this covers and helps the users, the cold room users who don't have transportations. On top of this, Colfresh is also providing extensive training to map and identify where are barriers in terms of inclusivity and in terms of adoption of the solution to make sure that these are addressed. And if we go to the next slide, please. One of the important aspects linked to this is the collection of gender disaggregated data and also the usage of this gender disaggregated data to inform the project implementation. And so in this slide, I'm presenting you with some numbers that were extracted from assessment survey that were done in the beginning of the project and a series of surveys that are still being carried out in terms of impact monitoring. And what is very interesting here is that Colfresh found out that female farmers were the ones that were the most affected by post-harvest losses before the beginning of the intervention. And thanks to the impact monitoring, they were able to show that using cold storage in combination with the Cultivate app was able to drastically reduce the post-harvest loss experienced by the users and to increase the revenue of the farmers by around 30%. I don't have a lot of time to go into all the details here, but the key message is really stressing again, I think the common thread within this webinar, which is the importance of really collecting and using data in a also using a gender disaggregated perspective, so that we are sure that different types of users and the needs of these different types of users are covered. Next slide. This is more as an outlook slide to close. What I want to focus here is basically understanding how can we use the data that we are collecting with the app to benefit the end users. It's clear already that digitalizing the operations at a cold rooms already gives us the big advantage, which is that instead of having all the data manually collected, we now have it somewhere in the cloud, which means it's very easy to access. It's very easy for us as project implementers to use this data to report on the impact, which is great. However, we can go beyond that, and we can try to think about how can this data be actually useful for the end users. And what I mean by this, it's mostly two aspects. The first aspect is that cooling companies can use the information from the utilization patterns, the performance of the different rooms, to actually prove their impact and show their creditworthiness to potential investors, which is one of the challenges that they're currently facing in terms of being able to scale and open more rooms. Similar aspect, but from a very different perspective, is the fact that for a farmer, the ability to show a track record of storage in the rooms of successful payment could be something that could really prove beneficial to access microcredit and loans, which for many farmers, and especially female farmers, are usually difficult to get in absence of collaterals. And we, as your BCCA, are starting going into this direction by working on designing and integrating an impact dashboard within the Cultivate app, with the aim of really exposing the data that we're collecting, both in terms of gender disaggregated data, impact data, and environmental data, to the benefit of the end users and of other stakeholders with whom this data can be shared. I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to get more questions in the Q&A session. Back to you, Simran.
Thank you, Roberta. That was really nice to see how gender inclusivity is being rolled out on the field. Just to keep the conversation rolling on some more examples of how we can make cooling more gender responsive, I think I would like to invite back Georgia to give us some more examples of what SEforALL is doing to promote sustainable cooling for all, especially focusing on gender.
Thank you. Thank you, Simran, and thank you to all the amazing speakers for sharing really so many insights. At SEforALL, we have started this year mainstreaming gender analysis and gender disaggregated data to as much as possible in all of our research on access to sustainable cooling for all. So we are working on the 2023 chilling prospects data on access to cooling gaps, and they will be released at the end of July. And this is just the beginning for us in terms of establishing first that baseline, and then tracking progress on access to cooling, also with a gender lens moving forward. And in this context, as we were starting our research and realized sort of on one hand, the data gaps that exist, and on the other hand, also the variety of organizations and people that are working on these issues on the ground and all over the world, we have started also building a repository of data stories on gender and cooling, working with the community of partners that work on access to cooling and on gender. And we hope to continue sort of collecting and sharing this knowledge with the community. And at the same time, sort of this is the first step, as I was saying earlier, in trying to understand better what are the different cooling needs of men and women in different sectors, whether it's in buildings and cities, agriculture, or healthcare. The next step is, of course, to mainstream gender or integrate gender considerations also in the solutions that we provide. And on this, in this sense, I want to share one specific opportunity that you see here on screen with all the young innovators and especially young female innovators out there. That is the This is Cool challenge for youth-led sustainable cooling solutions. This is an initiative that this year we are rolling out in partnership with BASE and with other partners with the Cool Up program, IBM, Tufts University in India, and the Hong Kong chapter of the American Institute of Architects. So it's a coalition of partners that's coming together to really issue a call for all young innovators out there to share their cooling solutions. We know that young innovators in countries in the global south, they are working on these issues and they are developing solutions that really address the needs of their communities. But sometimes they face challenges in accessing both the finance, but also the networks and resources that can help them demonstrate their ideas or scale their businesses. And these challenges sometimes often compound when we're talking about entrepreneurs that are both young and female. So we really want to try and break down these barriers and really reward interesting innovations on sustainable cooling all over the world, and particularly focusing on four use cases, let's say, cooling for thermal comfort, cooling for nutrition and agriculture, for healthcare, and also on cooling and AI. So how can AI sort of power sustainable cooling for all? The challenge is now live. So I really want to invite everyone to share it through their network. And also, you know, if you're a young entrepreneur listening, to apply for the challenge. And I just wanted to share here the link, the QR code to learn more. And what is interesting is that I think this is a double opportunity in terms of gender. On one hand, we're looking for solutions that have high potential for impact, both in terms of sustainability, so reducing the greenhouse gases from cooling solutions, or reducing food losses, for example, improving thermal comfort, but also in terms of access and inclusivity. And we are really encouraging in the application process to tell us what's the expected impact of the solutions on individuals in their communities, including on women and youth. So we really hope to also see, learn from these applications on what are the solutions out there and how they are improving access to cooling for women. At the same time, we also want to engage and reward young female innovators. And we have a really good example from last year. The winner was a social impact company from from Kenya, and they had solar freeze. So the solution is a post-harvest cold storage for small-scale farmers. That is affordable with interesting innovative business models and IT solutions, but they also engaged in training 100 young women in rural areas aged 18 to 30, if I remember correctly, to teach them how to operate and how to repair these cold storages. So this is a really interesting example, and we hope to see many more this year. So yeah, over to you, Simran, to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Georgia. I see that there's been a lot of conversation happening in the Q&A section, and the panelists have been interacting with some of the attendees. I think there's a lot of conversation on the sustainability of Cultivate and also about the report that Martha spoke about. So in these cases, I think you can also connect with the speakers post the webinar and learn about their solutions and reports more. Just in the interest of time, I think I would pose one very quick question to all our panelists, and it could be fairly quick, which would be, what is one key takeaway from the session that you would want our audience to remember? And I think we can just go in the order that we spoke today. So we could start with Georgia, going all the way to Roberta, and we can keep it super quick in the interest of time.
Thank you. Of course, no, the one key takeaway for me is that really, when we look at a warming planet, sustainable cooling, it really is a matter of adapting, of thriving. It's not a luxury. And when women are facing discrimination or are left behind in electricity access, in data collection, in for example, urban renovation programs, they risk to be left behind also from a climate justice perspective. So I think when we talk about cooling, we need to keep in mind how women are affected by a warming climate, and also how can they can be part of the solution. We saw so many good examples, and hope to see a lot more.
Thank you. Martha?
I think just to add on to what Georgia has just mentioned is in the appliances space, broadly speaking, so cooling as a subset of the broader appliance sector is the idea around standardizing the data that we collect, how we collect that data, so not just the information, but the process as well, and then sharing that amongst ourselves so that we have a wider pool of information from which we can draw insights and make decisions a little faster.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Perry?
Great. I would add to Martha's point that we've seen a disproportionate effect on women, and there's a disproportionate opportunity for women to lead in this area, but they can only lead if they are empowered with and through data. So we all have to invest in capacity to help those women assume the driver's seat and bring sustainable energy to many. Thank you.
Thank you. And Roberta?
I would like to follow up on what Perry said in terms of capacity building. I think it's really important as well to make sure that the data that we collect is understood, both at the level of the collection and also at the level of then utilization. And I think this is something that sometimes it's a bit not properly considered, in the sense that we are making a lot of efforts to collect a lot of data, but how do we make sure that the quality of the data that is going to be then used to inform policies and projects is actually high quality and good standards.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists for joining today and sharing such useful insights. One thing that we have all learned through this conversation is that gender work is not a box-ticking exercise. It is not decorative, but it's integral to project design and implementation. It's only when it permeates every aspect and consideration will our cooling interventions become truly effective and equitable. And it all starts with how gender statistics are created, used, promoted, not just at a global, regional, and country level, but also when it comes to sharing impact stories of individuals and realizing local realities. So I think with that, I would like to wrap up the webinar. For those of you that joined and posed questions, thank you so much. The slides will be made available soon, so you will have an opportunity to go through the content again and connect with our speakers. Thank you and have a lovely afternoon, evening to everybody.